The music room smelled faintly of old wood and dust, mingled with the sharp tang of brass instruments that had been untouched for weeks. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the scattered sheet music and worn chairs. I sat slumped in the corner, my back pressed against the chipped wall, fingers tracing the faded words on a forgotten music stand. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the floor and the distant murmur of voices from the hallway. But inside this room, surrounded by instruments that once promised escape and joy, I felt more alone than ever. I stared blankly at the sheet music, the notes blurring together in my tired eyes. What was the point? The melodies that used to lift me now seemed like a cruel reminder of everything I was losing. The piano in the corner, its keys worn and yellowed, sat silent, as if waiting for a touch I no longer had the will to give. Around me, the walls were adorned with posters of concerts and music festivals, images of people smiling and playing with passion. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt anything close to that. The music room, once a sanctuary, had become a cage. My thoughts drifted, heavy and restless, like a storm cloud refusing to break. The anger inside me simmered beneath the surface, a hot, bitter flame that I struggled to contain. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms, trying to hold back the frustration that threatened to spill over. Behind the walls of this quiet room, the chaos of my life raged on, but here I was trapped with nothing but my own spiraling thoughts. I thought about my family, or rather, the fractured pieces of what should have been one. At home, the tension was a constant undercurrent, like a wave waiting to crash. Arguments exploded over small things. Missed curfews, bad grades, broken promises, and left behind silence so thick I could almost taste it. My parents, once my anchors, now seemed like strangers locked in their own battles, leaving me to navigate the wreckage alone. The weight of their disappointment pressed down on me, heavier than any burden I had ever carried. School was no refuge either. The hallways buzzed with noise and laughter that felt foreign to me, like watching a play from the outside, unable to join in. Friends had drifted away, pulled by their own lives and problems, leaving me isolated in a sea of faces. I wasn't sure where I belonged anymore. The teachers saw only a rebellious kid, a troublemaker who slouched through classes and snapped at anyone who tried to help. I hated the label, but I couldn't argue with it. I was angry, hurt, and tired, too tired to fight for anything, even myself. Music had been different once. It had been my refuge, a place where I could lose myself and forget. The piano keys had felt like old friends beneath my fingers, the melodies a language I understood better than words. But now that connection had frayed, replaced by a numbness I couldn't shake. I wanted to feel that spark again, but it seemed buried beneath layers of pain and doubt. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the narrow windows, casting long shadows across the room. I shifted, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and glanced at the clock mounted near the ceiling. Time moved slowly here, dragging me deeper into my thoughts. I wondered how long I had been sitting like this, disconnected and drifting. The questions echoed in my mind. Why did it have to be this way? Was there any way out of the darkness I was sinking into? A sudden noise startled me, a faint tapping at the door. I tensed, heart pounding, unsure if I wanted to be interrupted or left alone. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure stepped inside, hesitating. It was Mr. Harris, the music teacher, his face lined with concern but soft with a quiet patience I hadn't noticed before. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway watching me. "You okay?" His voice was gentle, cautious. I shrugged, unwilling to meet his eyes. "Fine." But the lie hung in the air, fragile and obvious. He moved closer, pulling a chair beside me and sitting down without a word. The silence between us was different now. Not empty but waiting, as if he was giving me space to speak or stay silent as I chose. I wanted to push him away, to retreat into my shell, but something in his calm presence made me pause. "I've noticed you haven't been around much," he said quietly. "And when you are, you don't seem like yourself." I looked away, feeling the sting of his words. They weren't accusations but an invitation, a bridge reaching out to a place I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. "It's nothing," I muttered. "Nothing can feel pretty big sometimes," he replied softly. "You don't have to carry it alone." His voice was steady, like an anchor in the storm swirling inside me. For a moment, I let the walls around my heart crack just a little. The anger, the loneliness, the confusion. They all crowded forward, clamoring for release. But the words stuck in my throat, tangled with fear and shame. I wasn't used to being vulnerable. I wasn't sure I knew how. The room seemed to close in around us, the instruments silent witnesses to a moment I wasn't ready to fully embrace. Yet beneath the weight of my silence something shifted. A faint glimmer of trust, fragile but real. Mr. Harris didn't push. He just waited, patient and steady, like the music that had once filled this space with hope. Outside, the world carried on, oblivious to the small revolution happening in this forgotten corner. I still felt lost, raw and uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I sensed the possibility of something more. The music room, with all its faded glory and silence, wasn't just a cage. It was a place where I might find a way back to myself. The afternoon light waned and the shadows deepened, but I stayed seated, shoulders slumped but heart a little less heavy. There was no magic fix, no sudden clarity, just a quiet moment of connection amid the chaos. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start. The days that followed slipped into a blur of gray, each one folding into the next with the same heavy weight pressing down on my chest. The music room remained my refuge, but even there, the silence was thick with memories I wasn't ready to face. I found myself drifting through the halls of school, a ghost among the chatter and laughter, holding tight to the fragments of myself that hadn't yet broken. At home, the tension was a constant drumbeat, relentless and unforgiving. Arguments erupted over the smallest things. A missed dish in the sink, a late night, a grade that wasn't good enough. The voices, sharp and cutting, bounced off the walls and settled deep inside me, where they festered into a bitter ache. My parents seemed like strangers locked in their own battles, their eyes tired and distant, unable or unwilling to see the storm raging inside their son. I remembered the nights when the fighting was worst, when the walls trembled with shouting and the silence afterward was heavier than the noise. I would lie awake, heart pounding, wondering if this was all there was: anger, pain, and a family unraveling at the seams. I wanted to scream, to break free from the cage of expectations and disappointments, but the words caught in my throat, tangled with fear and shame. School offered little escape. The halls were crowded with faces that blurred together. Friends who had once stood by me now drifting away like leaves in the wind. I wasn't angry at them. I understood that everyone had their own battles to fight, but their absence carved a hollow where friendship used to be, leaving me isolated and adrift. Teachers looked at me with tired eyes, seeing only a troublemaker, a kid who slouched through classes and pushed away help. I hated that label. I hated that I had become the angry kid, the one who snapped back and shut down. But beneath the defiance was a deep well of hurt and confusion that I didn't know how to express. I wanted to be different, to be better, but every attempt felt like stepping onto a path that disappeared beneath my feet. Sometimes I found myself wandering the school, aimless and lost, drawn back to the music room like a moth to a fading flame. The instruments sat silent, their voices stilled by neglect, but I could almost hear their whispers, reminders of a time when music was my language, my solace. I'd run my fingers over the worn keys of the piano or cradle a violin, feeling the rough wood beneath my skin, the cold metal of the strings. The memories of playing, of losing myself in melodies, flickered like distant stars in a dark sky. Those moments were brief and fragile, but they kept a small part of me alive. I remembered how the music once made the world feel less heavy, how the notes carried me away from pain and into something beautiful. It was a stark contrast to the turmoil that filled the rest of my days. The fights at home, the failing grades, the silent phone calls from friends who no longer answered. Rebellion became my shield. I skipped classes, stayed out late, and pushed people away before they could leave me. It was easier to be angry than to be hurt. I wore my defiance like armor, a mask to hide the cracks beneath. But every act of rebellion chipped away at the person I wanted to be, leaving behind a shell that even I barely recognized. Late at night, when the world was quiet and the weight of the day settled on my shoulders, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The silence pressed in and the questions came flooding back. Why was I so angry? Why did it always feel like I was fighting a losing battle? Was there any way out of this mess I'd made of my life? I thought about the music teacher, Mr. Harris, and the way he had sat beside me that afternoon in the music room. His calm patience had been a small light in the darkness, a reminder that someone saw me beyond the anger and the mistakes. I wasn't sure if I was ready to trust that light, but it lingered, a quiet invitation to something more. One afternoon, after another day of slipping through the cracks of school and home, I found myself back in the music room, the worn keys of the piano calling to me. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the keys, trembling with uncertainty. The first note was hesitant and shaky, but it broke the silence like a crack in the wall. Slowly, the melody grew, a tentative thread weaving through the heavy air. As I played, memories surfaced, of my father tapping his foot to a song on the radio, of my mother humming lullabies when I was small, of quiet afternoons spent lost in music. The notes carried a bittersweet ache, a reminder of what I had lost and what I might still find. The music was raw and imperfect, but it was mine, a voice I hadn't heard in a long time. The piano became a mirror reflecting my struggles and hopes, a place where the chaos of my life could be shaped into something real and honest. Each chord was a step back from the edge, a small victory over the darkness. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared to name hope. But the path wasn't smooth. The anger still flared, the loneliness still gnawed, and the weight of expectations pressed down relentlessly. I stumbled through days filled with mistakes and regrets, but the music kept pulling me back, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. I began to see glimpses of myself beneath the layers of pain. A kid who loved music fiercely, who longed for connection, who wasn't ready to give up. It was a fragile discovery, one that I held close, even as the world around me threatened to unravel. The contrast between the boy I was and the boy I wanted to be was stark. Music was no longer just an escape. It was becoming a way to understand myself, to make sense of the anger and hurt. It was a language I could speak when words failed, a path toward healing that I was only beginning to see. In the quiet moments alone with the instruments, I started to dream again. Not of perfection or escape, but of finding my way back to something real. A place where I could be more than the sum of my mistakes and pain. The journey was just beginning, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of determination beneath the weight of my struggles. The music room, once a place of silence and shadows, was slowly becoming a space of possibility. The instruments waited patiently, their voices ready to be heard once more. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that if I could find the courage to listen, the music might just lead me home. The tension in my chest tightened like a noose the day everything seemed to collapse at once. It started as a whisper inside my head, a growing sense of frustration that I couldn't shake, a restless storm that churned beneath my skin. I tried to ignore it, pushing it down with anger and silence, but the pressure built until it was impossible to hold back. That morning, the usual chaos at home erupted louder than ever. A forgotten assignment, a sharp word from my mother, and the weight of unspoken disappointments exploded into shouting matches that left the air crackling with bitterness. I slammed the door on my way out, the sound echoing down the empty hallways like a gunshot. The world outside felt cold and indifferent as I stormed through the streets, every step fueled by anger and a desperate need to escape. At school, things didn't get any better. Teachers cornered me with questions I couldn't answer, their eyes full of judgment. Friends who had lingered at the edges of my life drifted away, whispers following me like shadows. I felt like a prisoner in a cage of my own making, trapped by mistakes and misunderstandings. By afternoon, I found myself back in the music room, a place that had once held promise but now felt like a mirror of my brokenness. I sank into the chair, head bowed, fists clenched so tightly my knuckles went white. The silence pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. I was drowning in the chaos of my thoughts, the relentless tide of pain and anger crashing over me. Then a voice broke through the storm. Mr. Harris stepped inside quietly, his eyes soft with understanding rather than disappointment. He didn't rush to fix or scold. He simply sat beside me, his presence steady and calm. I wanted to push him away, to retreat into the darkness, but something in his quiet patience held me there. "You don't have to carry it all alone," he said softly. His words stirred something fragile inside me, a flicker of hope buried beneath the rubble. I wanted to believe him, to reach for something beyond the pain, but the walls I'd built felt unbreakable. As the afternoon faded into evening, I let the tears come, silent and bitter, a release I hadn't allowed myself in a long time. The music room filled with the sound of my quiet sobs, and for the first time, I didn't feel completely alone. In the days that followed, memories surfaced unbidden. Moments when music had been my sanctuary. I thought back to the first time I heard a piano's melody ripple through the house, to the way a song could calm the storm inside me. Those memories were bittersweet, reminders of a peace I once knew but had lost sight of amid the chaos. I realized how far I'd drifted from that place, how the anger and loneliness had swallowed the music whole. But beneath the pain, a small voice whispered that it wasn't too late, that maybe, just maybe, I could find my way back. One afternoon, Mr. Harris shared a story, his own journey through hardship and doubt, and how music and faith had pulled him from the edge. His words weren't preachy or forced. They were honest and raw, like a lifeline thrown across the chasm. Listening to him, I felt a crack in my armor, a tentative opening in the fortress of my pain. It was the first time I'd considered that there might be more to life than the cycle of anger and isolation I'd been trapped in, that maybe with someone's help I could begin to heal. I started to look at the music room differently, not as a silent prison but as a place where I might find a voice. The piano keys no longer felt cold and distant but inviting, a bridge to a part of myself I'd forgotten. I began to imagine a future where music wasn't just an escape but a path forward. Yet the fear lingered. Could I really change? Was I strong enough to face the pain and let go of the anger? Those questions haunted me, but the small spark of hope kept flickering, growing brighter with each day. The days weren't easy. The weight of my past mistakes and the scars of broken relationships pressed down relentlessly. But in the quiet moments with the music, I found a fragile peace, a temporary truce with the chaos inside. I still stumbled, still faltered under the pressure, but I no longer felt completely trapped. The music room became a sanctuary where I could face the darkness, one note at a time. And in that space I began to believe that healing was possible, that beyond the pain and anger, there was a song waiting to be sung. The music room felt heavier that afternoon, the air thick with the weight of everything I had been holding inside. My hands trembled as I sat before the piano, the worn keys cold beneath my fingers. I wanted to play, to lose myself in the familiar flow of notes, but the anger and frustration simmering just beneath the surface made it impossible. Instead, I clenched my jaw, the tension building until it was a raw ache deep in my chest. I tried to breathe slow and steady, but the storm inside me raged on. Every memory, every harsh word from home, every disappointment from school pressed in, threatening to swallow me whole. The music room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, silent, suffocating, and full of echoes of everything I was running from. The door creaked open quietly, and I barely turned my head. Mr. Harris stepped in, his eyes soft but serious, watching me with a patience I hadn't earned. He didn't say a word at first, just settled into the chair beside me, the scrape against the floor loud in the heavy silence. "I know it's hard," he said finally, voice low, almost a whisper. "More than you let on." I wanted to snap back, to push him away like I did with everyone else. But the rawness in his eyes stopped me. There was no judgment, no disappointment, just understanding. And for once that was something I could hold on to, even if only for a moment. "I'm tired," I admitted, the words barely more than a breath. "Tired of fighting. Tired of feeling like I'm stuck." He nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for me to say it. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones inside us. But you don't have to face them alone." The room seemed to close in around us, the instruments silent witnesses to a fragile moment hanging between anger and hope. I swallowed hard, feeling the walls I'd built begin to crack, the raw edges of my pain exposed for the first time in a long while. "Music helped me once," I said, voice rough. "But I don't know if it can anymore." Mr. Harris smiled gently, the kind of smile that carries years of quiet wisdom. "It's not just about playing notes or hitting the right keys. Music is a language of the heart. It can carry what words can't." I looked away, the tears welling before I could stop them. I hated being weak, hated that my anger was spilling out like this. But beneath it all I felt a flicker, a fragile thread connecting me back to something real. "You don't have to be perfect," he continued. "You just have to be honest." For a long time I just sat there, the silence stretching between us like a bridge. Then slowly I let my fingers rest on the keys. The first note was hesitant, shaky, but it broke the silence like a crack in a wall. I closed my eyes as the melody unfolded, rough and raw but mine. With every note, The tightness in my chest loosened a little. The anger didn't disappear, but it no longer felt like a weight dragging me down. Instead, it became part of the song, a thread woven into something new. Mr. Harris didn't say anything, just listened, his presence steady and calm. When the last note faded, I opened my eyes and met his gaze. There was no applause, no praise, just a quiet understanding that this was a beginning. The days after that afternoon blurred with small victories and setbacks. Some moments I felt close to breaking, the old anger flaring up without warning. But whenever I came back to the music room, the piano was there, waiting patiently. I started to come early, stay late, letting the music fill the spaces where words failed. Slowly, the melodies became less about escape and more about expression. My anger, my pain, my hope, all finding a voice in the keys beneath my fingers. Mr. Harris began to share stories of his own struggles, moments when he felt lost and broken but found strength through music and faith. His openness was a lifeline, a reminder that pain didn't have to be the end of the story. One afternoon, as I played a particularly rough piece filled with jagged notes and sudden silences, he spoke softly. "Sometimes the hardest music to play is the one that tells our truth." I nodded, feeling the truth of it deep in my bones. Music wasn't just a distraction anymore. It was a way to confront the darkness inside me, to shape it into something I could bear. The more I played, the more I realized how much I had been holding back. Not just from others but from myself. The anger was real, but it wasn't all there was. Beneath it lay fear, loneliness, and a desperate need to be seen and understood. In the quiet of the music room, I began to tear down the walls piece by piece. The process was messy and painful, filled with moments of doubt and frustration. But with Mr. Harris's quiet support, I learned to face the darkness without flinching. One evening, after a particularly hard day at home, I found myself back at the piano, fingers trembling as I reached for the keys. The melody was jagged, imperfect, but it carried the weight of everything I couldn't say aloud. As the notes filled the room, I felt a shift, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way through the pain. The music wasn't magic, and the anger didn't vanish overnight, but it became part of a larger story, one where healing was possible. Mr. Harris watched me play, a quiet smile on his face. "You're finding your voice," he said softly. For the first time in a long time, I believed him. The music room wasn't just a place of escape or silence anymore. It was a place of reckoning, of truth, and of beginnings. And in that moment, I knew I was ready to keep fighting. Not just with anger, but with hope. The afternoon light filtered softly through the blinds, casting stripes across the worn piano keys as Mr. Harris settled beside me in the music room. His face held that familiar blend of quiet patience and gentle encouragement, but today there was something more. An openness he rarely showed, as if he was about to share a secret long kept close. "I want to tell you a story," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. "About when I was your age. I was lost, angry, and sure nobody understood me. Music was the only thing that kept me going." I shifted uncomfortably, unused to hearing anything personal from him beyond lessons and quiet support. Yet I found myself leaning in, the hum of the school fading away as he spoke. "There was a time I almost gave up," he continued. "I felt like the world was closing in, like the darkness would swallow me whole. But then a teacher, much like the one I had now, showed me that music and faith could be more than just notes on a page. They could be a lifeline." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of experience, like a map drawn from scars and triumphs. I wanted to believe him, to feel that same spark of hope flickering inside. But the walls I'd built were tall, and the shadows deep. "Faith," I echoed quietly, the word foreign on my tongue. He nodded. "Not in a way that demands perfection or blind belief, but faith in something bigger than the pain, bigger than the mistakes. Faith that you can find your way back, even when it feels impossible." The room around us seemed to soften, the instruments waiting patiently as his story unfolded. I swallowed hard, the knot in my chest tightening as I wrestled with the idea of hope beyond the anger. "I know it's hard to trust," he said, eyes meeting mine with an honesty that cut through the silence. "But sometimes when you let that faith in, it opens doors you thought were locked forever." I glanced down at my hands, resting on the piano keys. The notes felt less cold today, almost inviting. Slowly, I let my fingers brush the keys, hesitating before a soft melody emerged, Tentative, raw but real. Mr. Harris smiled, a flicker of pride in his eyes. See? Music is a conversation not just with others but with yourself and with whatever you believe in. It's where you can find strength when everything else feels broken. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe there was more than the anger and pain that had defined me for so long. The idea of faith, of hope beyond the chaos, felt fragile but alluring. A whisper of light in the dark. Over the next few days, I found myself returning to that story, mulling over his words in the quiet moments between classes and restless nights. The music room became more than a place to escape. It became a space where I could imagine something different, where hope wasn't just a distant dream but a possibility. I began attending the after-school sessions Mr. Harris offered, hesitant at first, but drawn by the promise of connection and understanding. The group was small, a handful of other kids who, like me, carried their own burdens and doubts. We played, struggled, and shared stories, finding in each other a fragile community built on music and trust. With every session, I felt the walls around my heart loosen a little. I was still angry, still uncertain, but the music and the faith that Mr. Harris spoke of began to seep in, filling cracks with light. I opened up about my struggles slowly, words stumbling out in fits and starts. The others listened without judgment, their own stories weaving into mine, creating a tapestry of shared pain and hope. Through this fragile connection, I started to see myself not as a lost cause, but as someone who could change, who could heal. The music was no longer just notes and rhythms. It was a language of redemption, a path forward. One evening, after a particularly difficult conversation at home, I found myself back in the music room, the piano waiting like an old friend. I let my fingers wander over the keys, the melody rising and falling with the turmoil inside me. As I played, I felt the anger release. Not disappear but soften, transformed into something I could live with. The music carried my pain, my hope, my doubts, all woven into a song that was mine. Mr. Harris joined me quietly, his presence steady and reassuring. "You're doing more than playing notes," he said softly. "You're finding your voice." That voice, fragile but growing stronger, was becoming my lifeline. It wasn't a cure or an escape, but a way to face the darkness, to embrace the struggle, and to keep moving forward. The journey was far from over. There were still days when the anger flared, when the loneliness threatened to swallow me whole. But with each note played, each story shared, I felt a little more capable of standing against the storm. Faith, I realized, wasn't about having all the answers. It was about trust in the process, in the music, and in the possibility that even broken pieces could be made whole. And as the music room filled with sound, with stories, and with fragile hope, I understood that this was more than just a lesson in music. It was a lesson in life, and I was finally beginning to learn. The days grew longer, and with each passing afternoon, I found myself stepping into the music room with a little less hesitation. The worn keys of the piano no longer felt foreign beneath my fingers. Instead, they welcomed me like an old friend. After-school sessions with Mr. Harris became a steady rhythm in my life, a place where I could shed the weight of the outside world and lose myself in sound. At first, I was quiet, letting the others take the lead, watching as they poured their struggles and hopes into the music. But slowly, the walls I'd built began to crumble. I started to share my story in fragments, snippets of pain, flashes of anger, and the fragile glimmers of hope I'd begun to see. The group listened without judgment, their eyes reflecting their own battles and triumphs. It was the first time in a long time that I felt understood, truly seen. Mr. Harris guided us gently, encouraging us to use music not just as an escape, but as a way to connect with ourselves and with each other. He spoke about discipline, about showing up even when it was hard, about the power of empathy and vulnerability. His words weren't just about music. They were lessons in life, woven into every chord we played. One afternoon, as the sun cast golden light across the room, I found myself opening up more than I ever had before. I told the group about the fights at home, the nights spent lying awake with the storm inside my head, the loneliness that clung to me like a shadow. My voice was shaky, but with every word, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. A girl named Maya reached out, her hand resting lightly on mine. "You're not alone," she said softly. "We all carry scars. But here we're a family." Her words pierced through the armor of isolation I'd worn for so long. In that moment, surrounded by others who understood, I felt a flicker of belonging. A fragile, beautiful thing. With their support, I began to embrace the discipline Mr. Harris spoke of. I showed up each day, even when the anger bubbled beneath the surface, even when the doubts whispered that I wasn't good enough. The music became a mirror, reflecting not just my pain, but my potential. The after-school sessions turned into a sanctuary, where I could practice more than scales and melodies. I practiced patience with myself and others. I learned to listen deeply, to hold space for the struggles that weren't always visible. And slowly, the anger that once consumed me softened into something more manageable. Mr. Harris introduced us to new instruments, encouraging us to explore and express in different ways. I picked up the guitar, fingers fumbling over strings that felt unfamiliar but exciting. The challenge was humbling, but it also reminded me that growth was possible, even when the path was difficult. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at home, I found myself back in the music room, guitar in hand. The chords were rough and uneven, but as I played, a melody emerged. A song shaped by pain, resilience, and hope. The music carried my story, not just as a burden, but as a testament to survival. Mr. Harris listened quietly, nodding with approval. "That's the power of music," he said. "It turns our struggles into something beautiful." The more I immersed myself in the sessions, the more I noticed changes beyond the music room. I began to face my family with a new sense of calm, even when tensions flared. I started to see my parents not just as adversaries, but as people burdened by their own struggles. It wasn't a perfect transformation, but it was a start. At school, I found myself reaching out to classmates I'd once ignored or pushed away. The walls of isolation cracked, replaced by tentative connections that brought unexpected comfort. I even offered help to a younger student struggling with math, surprising myself with the patience and empathy I was learning to cultivate. Music became a bridge, a way to connect not only with others but with the parts of myself I'd long buried. It gave voice to feelings I couldn't articulate, a language that transcended words. One afternoon, as we prepared for a small recital, Mr. Harris pulled me aside. "You've come a long way," he said, eyes shining with pride. "Your music tells your story, and it's powerful." I swallowed the lump in my throat, the weight of his words settling deep inside. For the first time, I believed that my story mattered, not just the pain but the healing too. The recital was a modest affair, a handful of students sharing their pieces in a quiet room filled with supportive faces. When my turn came, I stepped onto the small stage, guitar in hand, heart pounding but steady. The spotlight was soft, the room hushed, and as I began to play, the notes flowed from a place deep within. The melody was imperfect, raw with emotion, but it carried everything I'd been holding inside. The anger, the hope, the journey. As the last chord faded, the room erupted in applause, but it was the sense of accomplishment and connection that stayed with me. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how far I'd come. From a kid drowning in anger and loneliness to someone beginning to find harmony in the chaos. The journey was far from over, and the road ahead was uncertain, but I was no longer afraid to walk it. Music had become more than a passion. It was a lifeline, a guide, and a source of strength. Through discipline and faith, through sharing and listening, I was learning to rebuild not just my skills but my spirit. And as I drifted to sleep, the melodies from the music room echoed softly in my mind, a promise that even in the darkest times, there was a song waiting to be sung. The weeks that followed felt like a slow unfolding, a gradual peeling back of old scars and guarded walls. With Mr. Harris's steady guidance, I found myself stepping into spaces I had once feared, reaching out to the fractured pieces of my life with tentative hands. The music room, once a place of refuge and silence, became a workshop for rebuilding not just melodies, but relationships. At home, the air remained thick with tension, but I began to approach it differently. Instead of retreating into anger or shutting down, I tried to bridge the distance. Conversations were awkward and sometimes ended in silence, but beneath the surface, something shifted. I caught glimpses of my parents' own struggles, their tired eyes and quiet regrets. It wasn't forgiveness overnight, but a fragile understanding took root. One evening, after a particularly strained dinner, I surprised myself by asking my mother about her day. The question hung between us, simple but heavy with significance. She hesitated, then shared a story about a challenge at work. I really listened, and for the first time in months felt a thread of connection. It was a small step but a start. School became a different kind of challenge. The halls were still crowded with faces I barely recognized, but I found strength in the music community Mr. Harris had helped us build. I began mentoring younger students who struggled with their own demons, sharing not just lessons in music, but the hard-won wisdom of resilience and hope. One afternoon, a boy named Caleb approached me after practice. His eyes were wary, guarded like mine had been. "I don't think I'm any good," he admitted quietly. I smiled, remembering my own doubts. "It's not about being perfect," I told him. "It's about showing up, trying, and not giving up." Watching him pick up the guitar and strum uncertainly, I saw myself reflected in his struggle. It was a reminder that healing wasn't a destination but a journey, one I was learning to walk alongside others. Music became more than notes on a page. It was a language of empathy and healing. Through it, I found a way to express what words couldn't capture: the pain, the hope, the messy process of growth. The melodies we crafted together were imperfect but alive, each one a testament to the battles fought and the victories won. Mr. Harris encouraged us to collaborate, to blend our voices and instruments into something greater than ourselves. The rehearsals were chaotic and filled with laughter and frustration, but they forged bonds stronger than any I'd known. We became a family, united by shared struggles and the transformative power of music. As the date of the school concert approached, nerves and excitement tangled inside me. The stage loomed like a mountain, but I was no longer the boy hiding in the shadows. I was part of something larger, carrying the stories of pain and healing woven into every note I played. The night of the concert arrived with a rush of energy. Backstage, I felt the familiar flutter of anxiety, but also a quiet confidence. I wasn't perfect and the music wasn't flawless, but it was real. When I stepped onto the stage, the lights warm on my face, the audience a sea of expectant eyes, I felt a calm settle over me. The first chord rang out clear and true, a declaration of everything I'd been through. As the music flowed, I saw faces in the crowd, friends, teachers, even a few family members, and felt the fragile threads of connection stretching taut. The melodies carried not just sound, but stories of struggle, resilience, and hope. When the last note faded, the applause was thunderous, but it was the quiet moments afterward that stayed with me. The smiles, the hugs, the whispered words of encouragement. I realized then that I wasn't just performing. I was sharing a piece of my soul. The journey from anger and isolation to this moment had been long and painful, but it had also been filled with growth and unexpected grace. The music had been my guide, a language that helped me make sense of the chaos inside. In the days after the concert, I felt a shift, not just in how others saw me but in how I saw myself. I was no longer defined solely by my mistakes or my pain. I was a young man learning to heal, to forgive, and to hope. The friendships I'd nurtured grew stronger, and the bonds with my family, though still fragile, showed signs of renewal. I began to understand that healing was not a destination but a continuous process, one that required patience, courage, and vulnerability. Through mentoring, I found purpose beyond myself. Helping others navigate their own struggles reminded me that none of us are truly alone, even in the darkest times. The music room remained a sacred space, a place where stories were told without words, where pain was transformed into beauty, and where hope was breathed into every note. As I looked ahead, I knew challenges would come. The road was far from smooth, and the shadows still lurked at times. But I also knew I had found a strength within me, a resilience born of struggle and nurtured by faith and community. In the quiet moments alone with my instruments, I felt whole in a way I never had before. The music was no longer just an escape. It was a testament to the journey I'd traveled and the future I was beginning to build. And with every melody, I sang not just for myself, but for anyone who had ever felt lost and broken, reminding them and myself that even in the darkest night, there is a song waiting to be sung. The gymnasium was packed, the air thick with anticipation and the soft murmur of families, friends, and teachers gathered to witness the school concert. The stage was set with rows of chairs, music stands, and a grand piano gleaming under the spotlight's glow. I sat backstage, guitar resting across my lap, heart pounding with a mix of nerves and something deeper, hope. This was the moment I had been working toward, a culmination of months filled with struggle and small victories. The room buzzed with energy, but I felt a calm settle over me, like the quiet before a storm. I thought back to the first time I had stepped into the music room, lost and angry, unable to find my voice. The journey had been long and painful, filled with setbacks and moments when I wanted to give up. But here I was, ready to share not just my music but my story. The lights dimmed, and the first notes floated through the air as the choir began their song. I listened, heart swelling with the harmony of voices united in purpose. When my turn came, I stood, fingers trembling slightly as I adjusted the strap of my guitar. The spotlight warmed my face, the audience a blur of expectant eyes. I took a deep breath and began to play. The melody was imperfect, raw with emotion, but it carried everything I had learned: the pain, the hope, the resilience. Each chord was a step forward, a declaration that I was more than the anger and loneliness that had once consumed me. As the song unfolded, I saw faces in the crowd, friends who had stood by me, teachers who had believed in me, even a few family members. Their eyes held something I hadn't seen in a long time: pride, understanding, and a quiet encouragement that steadied my nerves. The music wove through the room, filling the space with a story that words alone could never capture. It was a story of struggle and healing, of falling and rising, of finding light in the darkest places. The applause that followed was thunderous, but it was the warmth in my chest, the knowledge that I had shared a piece of my soul, that stayed with me. After the concert, the hallways were alive with congratulations and smiles. Friends clapped me on the back, teachers offered kind words, and younger students looked at me with new respect. For the first time, I felt like I belonged, not just in the music room but in the world beyond. The journey hadn't erased the scars or silenced the doubts, but it had given me something stronger: a sense of purpose and the courage to keep moving forward. Music had been my guide, a language that helped me make sense of my pain and transform it into something beautiful. In the weeks that followed, I continued to nurture the connections I had made with friends, family, and the music community that had become my second family. I found myself mentoring others who struggled, sharing the lessons I had learned about resilience and hope. The relationship with my family remained fragile, but conversations grew longer, and silences less heavy. We were learning to understand each other anew, rebuilding trust one careful step at a time. The music room, once a place of solitude and sorrow, was now a place of joy and growth. I joined small groups, led workshops, and found fulfillment in helping others discover their own voices. One afternoon, as I tended to a small garden behind the school, the scent of blooming flowers mingling with the fresh earth, I felt a profound sense of peace. The struggles that had once felt overwhelming were still there, but they no longer defined me. I had become more than my pain. I was a young man shaped by it but not controlled by it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, I thought about the path ahead. It would not be easy, and the challenges would not vanish overnight. But I was ready. I had found strength in music, in friendship, and in faith, a quiet flame that would guide me through whatever came next. Surrounded by friends and neighbors, I felt whole in a way I never had before. The journey from heartache to harmony was ongoing, but the song inside me was strong and clear. And so, with a heart full of hope and a spirit unbroken, I stepped forward into the future, ready to sing my song, to share my story, and to embrace whatever life had in store.